This is a fan-generated show. If you would like to support us, please go to jamieglazov.com, and also don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. All your support is greatly appreciated.
Welcome to the Glazov gang. I'm Ari David, sitting in for Jamie Glazov tonight. We have an amazing guest coming in tonight to talk about interesting things. Raymond Ibrahim, a Shillman Fellow from the David Horowitz Freedom Center, will be on with me to talk about a very interesting subject. An article he wrote last week has to do with the conversion rates and the historical adherence to other religions besides Islam in lands that are mostly controlled by Islam today. So, Raymond, thank you for joining me. And what would you like to say about your article? Where's the good starting point for it?
Sure, Ari. There's a lot to be said. The reason I wrote that article is to point out that today we're kind of an ahistorical society. And what I mean by that is if history doesn't fit into our narrative, including the narrative of multiculturalism, then it just gets ignored. And so I wanted to try to show how the Islamic world, the way it came into being, is in fact based on what history teaches, which is that Islam spread through the sword. This is what Muslim historians have written throughout the medieval era, and this is what non-Muslim historians have written. But as I said, this has become a sidetracked topic because it doesn't fit into the narrative. So what I wanted to point out is a kind of common sense approach to show that, in fact, the Islamic world came into being through violence, coercion, bloodshed, extortion, and so forth. And that is exactly how subject peoples, non-Muslims, eventually embraced Islam, because that was the only way to escape. So I use Egypt as a paradigm because it's one of the most important Muslim nations. It's one of the oldest nations, and it's one that we have a lot of historical records for. And what most people don't know, our starting point, is that in the 7th century, when Islam entered into Egypt, Egypt was a heavily Christian nation, probably more so than very few other countries or regions around, definitely more than Europe. Other competitors would have been Syria, Anatolia, or modern-day Turkey, and so forth. And we have a lot of evidence for that. So, for example, only recently it was shown that the oldest picture of Christ is found in Egypt, drawn somewhere. The oldest New Testament fragment comes from Egypt. So we have a lot of evidence that this was a heavily Christian nation. Now, the second factor that I think most modern people overlook is that in that era, when you were born into a religion, and so the Copts were born into Christianity, this is not like how we think of religion as it's something that you can change just as frequently as you change your shoes. So I'm born a Christian, tomorrow I want to become a Jew, next week I'll become a Hindu or a Buddhist. That sort of mentality, which I think flows in the Western psyche, is very anachronistic to project it on medieval man of whatever religion. If you're born a Muslim in the medieval era, it's going to take a lot to make you leave your religion, simply because that is your fiber, that's all you know. There is no other alternative narrative. There's no so-called science versus God claims and all of this. So if you're born in, let's say, medieval Europe, you're born as a Christian, this is it. This is your worldview. This is foundational to your identity. So the question becomes, what would make a person leave their faith? Especially when that faith, Christianity and Islam and others, teach that if you apostatize, you go to hell. So in other words, it's not a light step. So now we go back to Egypt, and it was a heavily Christian nation, and you get Muslims entering it, and we find that over the century, and especially later centuries, when Muslim numbers started to grow, that Christians started just converting in mass constantly. And so the question becomes, why? Is it because of Islam's intrinsic appeal that these people who were, again, let's not anachronize, these are people who were born in a different era. Christianity is all they know, just like a Jew. Judaism's all he knows, just like a Muslim. So to convert, to me, indicates that they actually encountered some very traumatizing circumstances. And now we go full back circle to the historical texts that I was alluding to, the ones that we as an ahistorical society have more or less jettisoned. If you read those texts, they make it perfectly clear that that's exactly what happened. So, for example, I have in mind the historical record, the volumes of the Egyptian Muslim historian who lived in the medieval era. He's known as al-Makrizi, and he records in his volumes and chronicles Muslims, caliphs, and so forth rising up against the Christians of Egypt, the Copts, burning their churches, enslaving their women, murdering their men, forcing people to convert and so forth. And he has various anecdotes. It's a multi-volume history. One of the anecdotes that was very interesting. One of the worst, most egregious attacks at the time under a Fatimid caliph known as Al-Hakim. According to Makrizi, he had burned and destroyed or turned into mosques 30,000 churches in Egypt and Syria. And again, that large, almost hard to believe number indicates how Christian the Near East was before Islam invaded. But what's interesting is after he talks about that, after he says 30,000 churches were destroyed and Christians were persecuted and so forth, he puts this very simple sentence, and he says, under these circumstances, a great many Copts converted to Islam. Allah Akbar. Okay, and so I think that right there. So you see, we've gone full circle, I believe, from a common sense point of view. As long as we don't project modernity onto medieval man, whether he's a Christian or a Muslim, you have to understand that the act of conversion was very rare, and it never happened because someone thought, hey, maybe that religion sounds better. It was because of dire circumstances. It was because of duress. And if you look at the historical records, in fact, they indicate exactly that. So I think it's a very plain story, and politicians, academics, and all the media heads need to catch up with it.
Yeah, and it also goes completely against the modern liberal narrative that constantly says that things like freedom, civil society, faith in God, a civil order are tired old ideas of the past. It really reveals that those are actually very modern, wonderful ideas that led to the modern world, and the so-called tired old ideas of the past are the same ideas we see played out in the ISIS territories vis-a-vis the Yazidis, which sound, to me, hauntingly similar to what you just said about the Christian Copts of Egypt several hundred years ago.
Right. Well, absolutely. And that's the thing, you look at, if you want a perfect picture of what was happening historically in the Middle East and other Islamic eventually conquered regions, ISIS is the place to go, because these guys have read their history, they've read their doctrine, they're trying to emulate it to a T, and they are. And so when you see all these horrific things, whether it's the burning of human beings, the torture, the selling humans as slaves and concubines, the beheadings, the crucifixions, all of this traces back and has so many precedents throughout Islamic history. But a similar point to what you were just saying right now is, I think one of the problems that the West has, and this is why I call it an ahistorical society, is that today, instead of building a first premise, the premise conclusion format, and as long as the second premise agrees with the first, we're okay. I think the first premise now in our culture is, in this context, is multiculturalism. That is, even though it's an ideology, it's taken as a fact. And so that's your foundation. And then I come up to you and say, well, Islam has done X, Y, and Z, violence, brutality, intolerance. Well, that doesn't work with the first principle. So it immediately gets jettisoned out, whether it is recorded in history, whether it is a product of common sense. And I think that's where we're at right now, where we are in this paradigm, or we use a paradigm that is built on ideals. They're built on multiculturalism, religious relativism, political correctness, and such, so that if anyone says anything, and it doesn't matter if it's real, it doesn't matter if there's a million historical sources documenting it, it just gets sidestepped and ignored.
Yes. Well, Raymond Ibrahim, Shillman Fellow of Journalism at the David Horowitz Freedom Center, thank you so much for joining me. Fascinating as always.
Thank you.
And thank you to Jamie Glazov for letting me, Ari David, fill in for him tonight. Please support the Glazov Gang. You in our audience, you are the reason we're here, and we need your help. So please go to jamieglazov.com and please contribute what you can to our crowdfunding efforts to raise the money to keep this show on the air. And make sure you go to youtube.com and subscribe to our YouTube channel, which is called The Glazov Gang. Thank you so much. This is Ari David. We'll see you next time.